How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
So today on Culture Architects, we're joined by Dr. Kent Wessinger. Kent's a researcher. He's the CEO and Chief People Scientist at Retention Partners. He's also the author of Bridges Over Ladders, Secure Growth and Fortify Revenue with Millennial Employees, Clients, and Members. Kent's proprietary research on the millennial generation tells us that the younger generations currently take up the largest share of the workforce. And yet here's the really interesting thing. 3/4 of all organizations are absolutely ill-equipped, and we're going to talk about this a lot, to attract, engage, and retain younger employees. I'm excited to get into the nitty-gritty of this research that Kent's done and its implications for leaders on my fellow culture architects. And I'm sure today's conversation is going to be a great learning opportunity for everybody listening of all ages. So Kent, welcome to Culture Architects.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here with you.
Well, that's great. So let's just go back and just for our listeners, Kent, give a little bit of background. So I know you've got a degree in practical theology. That's just even an interesting title to me. And then later there, you went on to study sustainable education. So tell me more about so what is practical theology and how'd you get into that?
David, in this kind of groups my research and what I do now all together in one big pot. I was raised in a hardcore blue-collar family. Practical means a lot to me. And I've also learned over the years that practical means a lot to leaders. Mm-hmm. And just to, the practical theology piece was related to me getting in touch with something that I felt that was driving me, that was propelling me. And I wanted to understand this desire, this lack of a better word, fire inside of me from a practical perspective, more than just a theoretical perspective. When I went back and got my PhD focused on sustainability education, I was also focused on, I had a research emphasis on studying cultures that were struggling through a socioeconomic crisis related to migration, especially employee migration, workforce migration. And I was searching for a practical solution to it because I heard a lot of leaders in developing nations theorize, hypothesize why their top tier workforce continued to migrate out of their country or their culture. And I was searching for them to provide them with practical pathways and practical answers to solve this issue that consistently debilitated the culture over and over and kept them suppressed and keep them from reaching the place that it needed to be as far as growth and success.
Interesting. And so is that what led you to, I know you moved to Jamaica back in the 90s. Is that what led you to go to Jamaica?
I did. I led a school in Jamaica. It was a vocational school. Again, very practical, hands-on. We taught woodworking, horticulture, culinary arts, auto mechanics. I mean, we taught the basics. And when our young students would graduate after a 3-year process, it was, I learned the art of a deal, lack of a better way to say it, when they graduated, because employers knew they were going to be equipped with a skill set that would not only help the employer, but that they knew that the employee would be successful. So yes, that's what got me back there was the desire to participate in an environment that I knew was struggling to become and accept the identity that I knew that they had.
So you helped to educate these young people in rural Jamaica. Did it end up to be the case that more of them stayed there, or were they still migrating? And what did you learn about that? And how did that get into your research?
I made every one of them sign a contract when they graduated.
All right.
I couldn't enforce it.
We coerced them to stay.
Yes, that they would stay. I will say that because I do keep in just almost uber contact with most of the graduates, and when they graduate, after they graduated the school, that about a third of them did migrate. And the reason they migrated is the same reason that I discovered not only in Jamaica, but in all developing nations that I studied. that the majority of developing nations have an interesting form of suppression. They do not advocate for entrepreneurship. In other words, they keep entrepreneurship suppressed. Now, whether that is because the governmental leaders are threatened by especially young, aggressive minds that want to advance and create something that would not only, elevate their lives, but elevate their culture. I'm not sure about that. But what I do know is that most of those developing nations have governments that suppress entrepreneurship. Some of those young entrepreneurs, they just could not be content in an environment where they could not follow that pathway that they felt called or led to be an entrepreneur. The overwhelming majority of the third that I have tracked that have come to this country, Canada or England, are entrepreneurs. And tragically, I will say, or unfortunately, those entrepreneurs are benefiting this country, Canada, and England, and not the nations that they are from. And which I think is not necessarily a good look on developing nations, nor does it benefit or help them rise above that socioeconomic crisis they've been steeped in for years.
Yeah. I remember reading this goes back to like when I was in college, I think. I remember reading a book or something about research about revolutions and how revolutions are more likely to happen when people have a glimpse of what a new world could be versus when they don't. In other words, if they have no idea that life could be different than this, then things stay the same forever. It's when a certain class begins to have some picture of there is something other than what we've gotten used to that things start to change. And so I'm thinking about that as it relates to your description of whether governments in developing nations are purposely squashing that or it's just culturally built into them, who knows? But bottom line is what I'm hearing you say is that when young people begin to get education and have an idea that they could create their own things, well, if I can't do it in my country, I'll go somewhere else where I can do it. And they leave. Which I suspect, it's interesting as I think about that, it seems like so many people that I've spoken to in the U.S. who are from other countries come here for opportunity because they see that there's this amazing opportunity that I could do whatever I want. And in my former country, wherever that happened to have been, I didn't have that opportunity. And so they come where the opportunities are. So how did that lead to, I know that, one of the things that for our audience that's most interesting about Kent is that where so many people read the research literature about what people have said, Kent has done his own primary research on thousands and thousands of young people around the world and what's important to them and what drives them, et cetera. So how did the research project get started? Where did that come from, Kent?
David, after living in developing nations in the Caribbean for 22 years, and I developed a research project that was focused on a crossroads. And that crossroads was, what is the relationship between socioeconomic crisis and entrepreneurship in developing nations? I spent 4 years researching that and speaking to leaders, people, especially all over the Caribbean, because that was my case study of 45 million people. And once I developed that, the door opened for me to be able to speak to a lot of leaders, not just in the Caribbean, but around the world in developing nations. And I began to present to them the pathway out of socioeconomic crisis and how critical entrepreneurship was. And I would speak to parliaments and again, on and on and on. And I was just extraordinarily blessed to have these just incredible doors open for me. However, now keep in mind, this was 10 years ago. I would have one consistent question when I was done that I could not answer that was maybe just fairly related to what I was talking about, but was a distant relationship. Okay. And that consistent question was, and I'm just going to word it, I'm going to quote most of the leaders. They would say, can you please tell me what's up with those damn millennials? And so, I would step back and I would say, I have 3 millennial children at home. I should be able to answer that. And I was walking through the Atlanta airport one day and I saw a book written on millennials by a well-known author. I picked it up, read it, noticed that it was endorsed by the who's who of organizational leaders. When I got done, I was very disturbed. And the reason I was disturbed was because I recognized that this book had been written from a sample size of 4 people, and 2 of them were his children. But yet these organizational leaders had taken the information in this book and embedded it into the growth strategy. And I was concerned about what would the outcomes look like if they were taking a sample size of 4 people and embedded into the growth strategy. And so I went onto Amazon and I found 31 books at the time. Remember, I was just focused on millennials, but I found 31 books focused on millennials. I ordered all 31, perused through all 31, and discovered that I could put all of them in one of 2 categories, either a small sample size or written by a crusty old baby boomer, which I am, by the way, but a crusty old baby boomer to throw the young generation under the bus for monetary reasons. So I asked myself a very simple question. What are leaders using to make critical decisions to their structure, to their culture, to their entire workforce, to their client base? What are leaders using to help them through this generational transition? So I developed a research project. It has 30 questions. It has 30 questions to baby boomers and Gen X, and it contrasts the same 30 questions to now Zillennials, Millennials, and Gen Z, which are the largest, as you already alluded to, block of the workforce. I'm able to take those delineations or those differences or those similarities between those answers and develop a pathway that will help leaders with informed, tested, practical solutions to navigate the transition, especially with the younger workforce that we're dealing with today. Now, one more side piece about that. I had no idea. I really had hoped that I could get 500 participants in the research project. That was my goal, 500 participants. Right now, today, there's a little bit over 53,000 participants from 33 nations. And it tells me something. The volume tells me something. It tells me that people are longing, looking, searching for solutions and answers to help them navigate this struggle that many seasoned leaders are having, attracting, engaging, and retaining, even keeping this younger workforce focused and accountable. There's a high degree of hunger and thirst for it, and it still exists to this day. It actually, in the last 2 years, I've seen that volume exponentially increase in a rate that I have not seen before, which tells me that thirst and hunger for leading and keeping the younger workforce accountable continues to grow and continues to be a concern among a lot of leaders.
So just for my sake and for our audience's sake, let's just define some parameters here so we're all talking the same language. So define for me first the different generations, like what is Generation Z, X, Millennials, all these, where are the boundaries around which those generations are? And then my second question, in case you want to combine these two, is roughly in today's workforce, what percentage of the workforce is this generation versus that generation versus another generation, just so we have some sense of what we're talking about?
I'll refer to Zillennials quite a bit in this conversation. Zillennials would be from Millennials, Gen Z. If you look at the U.S. Census Bureau, that's what I use to determine or delineate these particular generations, because there's a lot of polling agencies that have kind of twisted some of the dates for monetary reasons and other reasons. A millennial, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, was born between 1982 and 2000. A Gen Z is 2001 to 2013. So the largest block of the workforce today, roughly about 56% of the workforce is Zillennial, which means they were born between 1982 and 2013. 1981 forward, Gen X. 1964 are backwards. 1964 and back, baby boomers. So I'm 1963. I'm right on the cusp of a baby boomer. But as we know, just logically, baby boomers are phasing out of the workforce. The largest block of the workforce is continuing to bloom, which is Zillennial.
Got it. And so that takes up to 2013. So yeah, that would be everybody that's in the workforce now. So do you, as you look at the research that you've done on these generations, I'm curious first, You mentioned 53,000 people in 30-some countries. Are there any major differences in how Zillennials, we'll call them, look at things in some countries versus others? Or is there a fair amount of consistency that if you're in this age group, no matter where you live or where you're from, you basically look at the world similarly?
Wow, David. You just spoke really into the deep, deep little closet of my passion right there that I don't get to talk about a whole lot. I get to talk about in just geeky academic environments, but I think it matters. I think what I'm about to say in your question matters a lot. Up until this point, and I don't want to pat my back too much, and I don't want to inflate the significance of the research too much, but up until this point, sociologists have always come to the conclusion that the environment in which we were raised has the highest level of determinants of who we are, our characteristics, the way we process things, the way we see things, the way we value things. Our environment is the most significant influence that we have over who we are as human beings. However, if I take the 500 participants from Sri Lanka, and I take 500 participants from Philadelphia, your city, or New York City, your city, which I've done many times. There's an interesting dynamic that comes from there. And the dynamic is that we're seeing especially amongst Zillennials, let me qualify that. We're seeing similar behavioral patterns. We're seeing very similar priorities. We're seeing very similar outcomes in their lives, in the way that they treat money, family, environment, work. There's a whole list of things. And so then we go, well, how could we have made the shift from our local environment being or having the highest level of priority of the development of who we are as a human being? And now we're seeing 500 people in Sri Lanka that are processing things almost identically as 500 people in Philadelphia are. And it comes down to one simple factor, one simple variable: the advent of technology and the access to technology. And so now what's happened is we've redefined local environment into a technology environment, which now has taken the place of the most significant piece of our behavior, not only as, family, from sociological perspectives, on and on and on, which also, there's a danger there too. And I think that everybody would recognize the danger that's associated with it. But technology is the driving force of the development of the human race today across the globe.
So if I'm going to paraphrase what I'm hearing you say, and tell me if I have this right, that what we're essentially saying is, because of technology, people all over the world are exposed to the same information roughly, and are therefore being influenced in a similar way. Whereas pre all these technological changes, I would have been mostly influenced by my local market because I didn't know what was going on in Philadelphia. If I was in Sri Lanka, I don't know what's going on in Philadelphia. Today, I know what's going on everywhere around the world because we're all exposed to the same information. Is that essentially what you're saying?
Spot on. And it's just, it's access. It's just access. And because the world has access today, and again, there's a lot of positive to that, but I would say it is completely balanced out with the negative components there as well. And the negative components is that we have, especially in a lot of developing nations around the world, we see them losing their identity to technology, because we see a younger workforce or a younger generation that is assimilating, maybe not from a geographical perspective, but from a mental perspective. They are assimilating into a culture in which they do not live. So they're processing it through those same things.
Interesting. Yeah. So let's shift then. So understanding that, let's talk about, it would seem to me then, and I imagine this, you find this in your research, you made the comment that a large percentage of the workforce today are Zillennials. And I'm guessing that a disproportionate percentage of the leaders are probably baby boomers. And so we presumably have this disconnect between, I'm a baby boomer leader, and I think like a baby boomer, but most of my workforce thinks differently from me. What are some of the key differences that in how Zillennials look at the world from how previous generations, presumably baby boomers, look at the world?
The only way I know how to delineate, the most effective way that I have learned to delineate that sounds like I'm being super hard on baby boomers and older Gen X. I'm not, because I've in full disclosure again, I am a baby boomer. Okay. It's this. I think it's the most simple way to look at it. Baby boomers and Gen X, especially baby boomers, see life through a ladder. I mean, how many times have we made this statement? You just have to climb the next rung on the ladder. You have to take a step to the next rung on the ladder. We see life as a ladder. It's a progression. It's climbing higher, climbing higher, climbing higher. The sacrifice, the commitment that's dedicated to going to the next rung on the ladder. And all of that is greatly appreciated, and all of that requires a lot of self-discipline. But we've climbed a ladder with a goal in mind. And that goal is that there's a pot of gold at the top, or, when we reach the top of that ladder, which technically, and by some definition is called retirement. However, all of a sudden, here comes millennials. And I'm not going to include Gen Z in this conversation, because millennials were right on. They had the front row seat to this. Okay. They saw the ladder. They saw witnessed millennials climbing the ladder. And again, they greatly appreciate the sacrifice and the commitment and the self-control and the discipline and all of those things that it took to climb the ladder. But at the same time, this generation had a front row seat to some of the greatest, if not the greatest, levels of dysfunction that we've ever seen in this country, with the highest divorce rates, the highest crime rates, the highest addiction rates. And in this generation, millennials took a step back and said, we appreciate commitment and self-control and discipline and all of those kind of things. But if accomplishment and success comes with all of those other things, I'm not so certain this is a pathway that we want to pursue. And so all of a sudden, we saw two ladder generations turn into a bridge generations. Hence, that's why I wrote the book, Bridges Over Ladders, is because now we see generations that aren't climbing ladders, they're building bridges. They also saw the ladders as reserved for me, myself, and I, for one person. I'm not sure there's a lot of millennials that would come on a podcast and tell you that baby boomers were the most selfish generation. I'm not sure they feel that way, but ladders were reserved for one person. They build bridges because collectively they want to take people somewhere. Collectively, they want to take a community. Collectively, they want to take a nation or a state or whatever it may be. They see life through this collective perspective of building bridges to other peoples, other mindsets, other cultures, instead of setting a ladder up against a wall and climbing it. So I said a lot to say the difference is I see a ladder generation and I see a bridge building generation. And I'm not saying that one is greater than the other. I'm just saying that is the delineating factor that I see. One generation building bridges, another one climbing ladders.
Well, it's interesting. So a couple thoughts come to my mind as I hear what you're saying. So one, I think just from a purely practical standpoint, certainly my observation, most of us, is the younger generations are more comfortable with collaborative kinds of things, whether it's sharing a workspace, whether it's sharing a home or your car, or an Airbnb, where older generations, no, I want my place, I want my car, I want my home. I don't want to share my stuff with somebody else. Where younger generations seem to be totally comfortable with sharing of things, which adds, it's another element in what I hear you saying about this sort of collaborative type of generation versus a more personal generation. The other thing that occurs to me as I listen to what you're saying is that I wonder if, you're describing the reason, we're guessing at, so why is this generation different? You're describing the reason, one of the primary reasons at least, as being they saw what being on the ladder got people and the negative stuff that went with it, and at some level said to themselves, I'm not sure it's worth it. I'm not sure that's what I want. I wonder if another part of that, though, is that some of the assumptions of that upward mobility are less assured today than they once were. And so let me give an example of what I mean by that. I think about, let's just take a look at real estate. We grew up, so I'm roughly the same age as you, and we grew up when it comes to real estate with the assumption that we were always told you should buy a bigger house than you can afford because real estate always goes up, doesn't it? And that house will be worth more and more and more, and you'll always do better. And so you should always go that way. Then, the real estate crisis hit, and all of a sudden homes were worth less than they were before. And it's like, wait a second, that whole assumption is gone. It doesn't work anymore. And so I look at my kids and they don't have that same assumption that, real estate's always going to go up, or certain economic factors that caused the promise of always doing better. That was just such a built-in assumption for our generation. You're always going to do better than your parents, and each generation does better than their parents. And all of a sudden, I'm not sure that's true anymore. So I wonder if some of that perspective from the younger generations, while some of it may be, I don't know that I want some of what that previous generation had, I wonder if some of it's also, I'm not sure the assumptions that I always had about what that older generation would get are going to be true for me. So I don't even want to go for that because I'm not sure it works. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, you're spot on. If there's 2 points of, and I hate to characterize them this way in my research, of great concern, one of them is the high level of concern that I see about life, structure, growth coming from the younger generation and the older generations. However, their concern is completely different. You targeted, you were spot on about the level of concern from the younger generation. The older generation, there is no metric that's increased more in my research since January 2020 than this question. Are you concerned about the future of your company or organization with the younger workforce? In January 2020, that number was 48%. Today, that's 83%. So more than 8 of 10 people are concerned. Now, I'm about to say something that really gets into your lane. What we know is this, is that a leader that is leading from a position of concern is creating a culture of concern. A culture of concern propagates some things that are very difficult to overcome. A culture of concern breeds uncertainty. The leader is uncertain about the outcomes in their company or organization because they're concerned about the very foundation that holds them up, which is the largest workforce working their way up. Ultimately, my research and implementation show me that a concerned leader cultivates a culture of uncertainty, which almost always ends in conflict. So there's internal conflict creating an implosion inside of the company or organization. Now, when we look at that from the younger generation, you're right. Their level of concern is, it's also about outcomes. We're concerned about the outcomes. We're concerned that some of the factors that my parents or my grandparents used to make decisions about not only their work, but their lives and their country and on and on and on. Those factors no longer seem valid, and they're even threatened. And because they are, we're looking for and this gets to really the point that I want to make here, is that I've discovered that all of the generations in the workforce, and I would even argue all of the generations in our country and around the world, we're all longing for the same thing. And it's a clearly defined path of growth and success. And that's what the younger generation is longing for from especially the older generations in the workplace. Can you provide me a clearly defined path of growth and success? Because what I've observed is the path that you were walking on or navigating is no longer clearly defined. It's very cloudy right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I need that clearly defined path of growth and success.
Or said another way, it may also be, not only is it cloudy, but I'm not sure the path you're on works.
Yes, I would agree.
It may not even work at all.
I was being nice,
cloudy
Dave.
or clear. Well, and I guess, there's probably a couple pieces to that. One is, from the younger generation's perspective, I'm not sure that path that you were on, you being older generations, works, or I'm not sure the path you're on gets you the outcome, would get me the outcome that I'm interested in. So I may be interested in a different outcome than you were interested in previously, hence your ladders and bridges. Folks, that brings us to the end of the first part of my conversation with researcher, author, and chief people scientist, Dr. Kent Wessinger. When we resume on Culture Architects, Kent and I are going to look to the future with the question, well, what happens when the Zillennials take up the mantle of leadership, as they've already started to do now? Kent weighs in on this and more in the next episode, so make sure to stay tuned.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event, or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.